Hello and welcome to the Monster Mechanics podcast, where we take creatures of myth and media and see how they can be improved. I am your host, Scott Paladin, and with me, as always, is the John, Paul, and George to my Ringo, Zach Jaquays. What are we talking about today, Zach?
Today we are talking about Djinn.
Okay, so we are talking about Djinn, or also known as genies. Genie is the originally French word that has become part of the English version of this.
Okay.
But the original word from Arabic is much closer to Djinn, J-I-N-N. So we're going to use them interchangeably. The original legend is that Djinn are sort of a catch-all term, like fairies or goblins or brownies or oni or any number of other sort of categories of creatures, as opposed to being a specific kind of thing.
So they're kind of like a magical force of nature almost.
Yeah, and it's really just, the word originally means something like hidden one, sort of implying creatures that are hidden from your senses. Mm-hmm. And it was really just a kind of a catch-all for any magical creature. So if you had been talking to a pre-Islamic Arabian and mentioned a fairy, they would say, "Oh, that's a djinn." Like, it's just their kind of word for that. There isn't like a strict canon from their original meaning. They were changed a bit in classical Arabian mythology. I'm going to make an aside here to say that I have a cursory knowledge of Arabian mythology. So if I am wrong, and I am sure I am wrong in a myriad of ways, feel free to hit me on Twitter about it. It's fine. I do want to be corrected. But I am going to tell you now that at least I'm doing it knowingly that I'm probably wrong on some of this stuff. So in more classical Arabian mythology, they did get canonized a bit. They interacted with Islamic religion in certain ways. They were mentioned in the Quran even. Mm-hmm. And they've been sort of, I can't even predictably describe how they were changed. They were made sort of more mortal. They were talked about a little bit as though they were angels and demons in certain ways.
Okay.
They show up probably most famously in 1001 Arabian Nights.
Sure.
By Scheherazade, which is a set of stories that actually date back to like pre-Arabian culture. There's a lot of apparently Indian influence on them. Mm-hmm. Some of the ideas, especially the idea of someone delaying their execution by telling many, many stories, seem to have been migrated over from Indian culture. Seems there's older stories there, which is kind of cool. But so they are mentioned a couple of times, not just a couple of times. They're all over the 1001 Arabian Nights. This is also the origin of Aladdin, which is probably the most famous depiction of a genie in our Western culture.
Thank you, Disney.
Yeah. And although the genie in the original 1001 Arabian Nights version of Aladdin can grant an infinite number of wishes.
Interesting.
But the idea of granting specifically 3 wishes also comes from 1001 Arabian Nights. It's just a different story. It's the Fisherman and the Djinn, I believe it's called. Mm-hmm. And it's about a fisherman who finds a bottle with a genie inside of it. And the genie's talking about, that's one of his offers to get people to let him out of the bottle, is that he'll give them 3 wishes of whatever they want.
Sure.
So it's kind of a bribe at that point. Mm-hmm. I know they're used in D&D as well. They're really just kind of there's a bunch of subspecies, aren't they, at that point?
Yeah. They kind of vary in power, and there's so many different subspecies, and they've kind of stratified them into they have Djinn lords and that kind of thing. And they range anywhere from the wish granting to the kind of just range from, very powerful creatures to
run of the mill.
Yeah, run of the mill, just almost representations of elemental forces.
Oh, okay. Yeah, they do have a pretty strong elemental bent when I've encountered them in D&D. Mm-hmm. That is somewhat there in the classical myths. They're strongly associated with fire, if I remember correctly. In the classical myths, fire is their thing. But that taking them in an elemental direction seems natural if they already have some of that in there. Mm-hmm. So what prompted this episode was Alice Kira, at Magical Girl Kira on Twitter, mentioned an idea to me that I love, which is that the power of a djinn is inversely proportional to how much freedom that djinn has.
Interesting.
Which is a neat idea. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if this particular idea for Alice, but certainly for me, the first time I encountered this was in Disney Afternoon's version of the television show of Aladdin. The genie is still a character, and he is far less powerful than he is in the movie because he is a free genie. If I recall. The idea that when you put restrictions on them, it sort of concentrates their power so that they can do more, but they have a lot less freedom and a lot less ability to direct that power in multiple different directions. Makes a kind of sense, right? Where it's a bit like taking a container that's filled with like a high pressure gas. If you put a little tiny hole in it, you're going to get a tiny jet of air that's moving very, very quickly.
Sure.
And you can do a lot with that. Whereas if you open a larger hole, it's going to empty itself much more quicker, and there's less you can do with that amount of power.
Today on Monster Mechanics, Ultimate Power and Delta P.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we're going to run with that idea, we have to sort of set the ground rules, maybe the play space that we're talking about here, right? Where like what's the nature of the Djinn in whatever world we're talking about. I like the idea of taking back to their origins as like kind of like a fey creature, something that lives apart from humanity and is maybe a mirror, they are like humans and they have culture like humans, but but it's all their own. Like they're not a copy of human culture or a copy of humans' society or anything like that. They have their own things which might be different and foreign.
Okay.
So that's kind of cool. That could be kind of cool. I guess magical in origin because they're going to have magical power in this world, right? Okay.
So an interesting thing with the sort of confinement being used to like amplify power almost or intensify power. In a culture like that, would freedom be viewed almost negatively?
It could, or it might be one of those things where putting those restrictions on a djinn or a genie might be a necessary evil. Like they might hate it, just like you wouldn't really like being a slave.
Sure.
But that they know that doing it is useful in a lot of ways.
Okay.
So it could be...
So this power is like manufactured within their own society?
You could do it that way, or maybe it's one of those things that they hate when this happens, but it does happen and they know it, and they're sort of prepared for it. I don't know.
So maybe there's someone out there who's trying to game the system, who's like discovered that like when under pressure, these djinn become more powerful and more valuable to them in certain ways.
Yeah, for sure. Well, like the idea is that So going back to the 1001 Arabian Nights version of the three wishes, right? This was an offer by the genie as a way to get himself out.
Okay.
So maybe there's something about, like, he's saying, like, I'll do whatever you want if you let me out. Maybe that's because in their default state, maybe genies or Djinn, like, they are unable to concentrate their power in a single direction.
Okay.
And, like, it's so much of their power just sort of leaks out around them. Like, just maintaining their existence requires magical energies.
Interesting.
And imagine I don't know, like something about them as it flows through them, like they're a natural font of magical energy, and maintaining themselves in the world just causes this stuff to flow out them. So maybe they're like always using magical energy. If they come into a room, like they're going to start doing things without meaning to. And when you put magical restrictions on them, when you catch them under a Jaquays or get them in a bottle that's been a vessel that's been specially prepared, you prevent them from all of that magical energy from flowing out naturally. And so it starts to build up the pressure inside instead. And then when you let it out, like, okay, well, now they have all this stuff. And you know what? Maybe it's like actually not painful, but like very discomforting for them because that is not their natural state. They're used to it just always flowing out.
Okay.
And it might feel like they have to pee real bad, like where they have all of this magical energy built up inside of them and no release for it. But if you allow them a direction to do that, either specific tasks in the form of wishes, or maybe it's even where just restricting what they can use that magical energy on might be one form of it that doesn't give you full wish power, but gives them lots of power in a single direction. Oh, maybe this is a way to rope the elemental nature back in.
Okay.
Which is that one level of the Djinn is that they have foregone all of the other elements. They have a restriction on, like, you've restricted them out of water and air and earth, and therefore all of their magical energy starts flowing into fire, and they become a fire Djinn.
Interesting.
And that might be the original proto Djinn is the formless, the one with no restrictions, the completely free Djinn. Yeah. In a way, they're very powerful because they, just by existing, they make changes in the world, but there's no direction to them. And then over time, some of them take on more restrictions and learn to live with the amount of discomfort that causes. Or maybe if it's as long as it's not allowed to flow out naturally in some direction, it's not discomforting. And that creates Djinn of various types. And it's just about what those restrictions are. Does that sound?
That sounds interesting. Something I'm curious about is like, obviously we've seen kind of like the powerful genie in the lamp as an example of like maybe at the upper end of the power scale. What happens if you like compress that further, or like do you get a Djinn singularity at some point?
I think that a Djinn that can't have its power let out at all is got to be disastrous, right? Like there is, if you contain them with no way for that power to come out, you basically make a bomb.
Interesting.
Because it's at some point the power is going to build up to the point where it overcomes whatever barriers you've put on it. And at that point, unrestrained magical energy is then introduced into, like, once it cracks, it comes out all at once instead of little bits at a time, and it just like all happens at once. All of the little changes they would have had.
Are we thinking sort of like ones of like just a massive wild surge?
Yeah, that's actually what I was thinking, where all of the changes that could have happened naturally over time as they were moving throughout the world all happen at once and over a massive area or to an incredibly massive degree, where like reality begins to break down.
Okay, I like
so
that.
Placing these restrictions on a Djinn, the more that you're trying to put on, the more that you're concentrating the power more and more, but the more you might run into a scenario where you accidentally restrict them too far and create the dangerous bomb. It's playing with fire, where you are trying to craft your, like, it might take the form of like a lawyer style contract or something along those, where you're writing all of the rules, like, okay, this but not this, this but not this, this but not this, because you want to translate it to a very narrow set of things they can do, but
you got to be careful not to like loophole something into...
or like the reverse of a loophole, where you're accidentally closing off all of the avenues. And in fact, loopholes are how you normally, like, that's maybe the easier way to screw up, is accidentally letting off too much energy and getting a Djinn who's not as powerful as you were expecting them to be.
So with these contracts, they'd basically have written in like pressure release valves.
That a smart, I don't know what we're going to call these guys, contract writer would build in things that it's like, if
no wishes have been made within 5 years,
like now you are allowed to do X or Y. And in fact, you could direct X or Y in useful areas. Like if you have no wishes asked of you within 5 years, you are allowed to go seek out somebody to get wishes from, because we need you to release that pressure. Okay, so yeah, I think this is kind of cool. It also brings in that whole contract nature, and especially a Djinn who has been unwillingly restricted into like the wish style Djinn, where they are very powerful. They can do like unreal amounts of things, but only at someone else's behest when they're asked to. And they would be so uncomfortable. It explains a lot of the monkey's paw crap that they end up pulling in Legend, because they don't want you to benefit from their suffering. And so like if you give them even a little bit of leeway, they are going to they're going to take that and screw you with it, because they are very unhappy with their situation. And
kind of to go full circle, like that's why all the legalese around the creation of like these rule sets came about.
Exactly. It's over time it's evolved. So like the first, you can imagine that the first people to actually do this were the Djinn to do that to themselves in order to get themselves more power, or because they kind of like, by restricting themselves out of certain elements, to become a fire Djinn. They like being a fire Djinn. Like it's not discomforting to them, especially because they're still in control of how they let that power out.
And it becomes an identity.
It becomes an identity. And in fact, there might be even a gradation of levels to it. Like you have Djinn who are warriors, and they are unable to use their magic for anything except for war. And you have Djinn who are fire elementals, who are fire Djinn, who are unable to use the other elements. And then a step above both of them is the fire warrior Djinn, who is only able to use their fire powers for war. But they can do incredible things with it because they have concentrated all of their magical energy in one direction, and even a much smaller direction than the other fire Djinn too, because they can only use it for war. But they are able to, they're acting like siege engines, instead of just regular old, in my head, I can't think of anything except firebenders from Avatar: The Last Airbender. Yeah. So it's like, instead of just the regular like fire soldier style guy, they are like, they're the amp boosted ones who come into battle and wreck the entire lines because they have so much power. But then you ask them to light a campfire and they're like, nope, can't do it. Sorry. It's just gone. Sorry.
So is the idea that these Djinn are very rare, or because I could see...
I think the restricted ones are rare, like the self-restricted ones, or the ones who are willing to allow themselves to be restricted more and more are more and more rare. Like going from the completely free-form Djinn, free Djinn who have no restrictions at all to like fire Djinn. Okay, that's like 1 in 4 is going to be some sort of elemental. But then the only 1 in 4 of the fire Djinn are going to let themselves be restricted further. And only 1 in 4 of those guys are going to let themselves be restricted further. So certainly when you're talking about ones who would do it willingly, it's an order of magnitude smaller each time, because only a small percent or a less than 50% percentage each time is going to be willing to do it, right?
So I'm wondering at what point you end up with single purpose Djinn, like when they release their power, it is for one sole purpose.
I could imagine if you have a big Djinn society, which is very complex, and they have some big need, you might end up with, the single purpose Djinn who do only one thing.
Like this might be like the immortality Djinn, whose sole purpose is to extend one person's life.
Yeah. That's a really good one for something you might get out of a Djinn you restrict. But can you imagine? Oh, no, wait. Okay, so in some versions of the Djinn, they're not immortal. That like regular old Djinn are kind of like elves, maybe, where they're maybe longer lived and more powerful than a regular human, but they have a lifespan. So there might be the one Djinn who has put himself under because the restrictions to make just other Djinn immortal, and that concentrates his power and also probably gives him the benefit of it. So over time, he's not going to die either, but only so that like once a year on a certain ceremony, they can take some super very powerful Djinn that they want to keep around, like king, one of the kings of the Djinn, or a great prophet or something like that. And they say, okay, you are immortal now. And that's a big part of their society. But you only need one of those, because if you did that too much, it like wrecks your society, right? You'd only need a couple of them. So that's totally cool. And then like separate from all of the self-restricting ones, you have like you catch a Djinn and you like make a thing out of them. That's where you see like the wish Djinn. Like no self-respecting free-willed person is probably going to like allow themselves to be trapped in a bottle for all eternity
so they can make someone else's dreams come true.
Right. Unless they're just the ultimate sub.
Well, they're already apparently into bondage, so.
Yeah, so, I mean, it might occasionally be one Djinn doing it to another in order to accomplish some sort of goal, because they're not all the same, right? Like they're going to have their own intersquabbles and everything. So there's probably going to be evil ones who do this, and there's also going to be humans or other species who are going to do this outside. So pulling back to our source material again, in 1001 Arabian Nights versions, it's often you have to trick them into something, like, which I kind of like. Like you can't just cast a spell and say, I have grabbed you out of nowhere. You are now captured. It has to be something where you like trick them or lure them or somehow like you make them agree to it in order to actually capture them.
That's a common trope with any sort of magical creature.
Yeah, it seems thematically appropriate for what we're talking about here.
And that might also just go back to, in stories, you always want to have your protagonist be someone clever.
Yeah, and because the lawyering and the loopholes and all of those things are so contractual and like lawyer in nature, that it feels like getting them to sign on the dotted line on something they don't truly understand is a totally like that seems really on point for what we're talking about. Now, and it might just be, it doesn't always have to be like, okay, I'm giving you this deal, but really there's a small print. It might also be like there are legends of like I find a Djinn who is in trouble, and in order to help them out, I get them to agree to do something for me. That's like the most basic version of that contract, where you're like you come across a Djinn who's I don't know, stuck under a tree, right? Like he had a tree fall on him, and he's just like, oh God, I can't lift this thing. And so you come across him, you're like, okay, I will totally let you out of this tree if you plow my field for you. And then for me. And he's like, oh, okay. And you do that. And he does his task and then goes on. Like that is the most basic form of the contract right there. And that is that's not even a exploitative relationship. That's just a contract. That's just you got them to agree to do something and they did it.
I feel like the evolution of that is like the loopholes again, where the genie's like, okay, well, I plowed your field. And the guy's like, well, I didn't say when you could stop.
Yeah. I didn't say just the once. I meant forever. And then Genie's like, oh, son of a bitch. And then you get into the battle of loopholage where he's like, well, you didn't say how to do it good.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got, I think that's a pretty held together structure for how we're going to handle how this would have come about and how it works. So it's a very lawyeristic, contracts-based system. What are some of the outcomes of a society that does this? Where if you can get someone to agree to it or trick them into it, you can get kind of almost anything done.
Yeah.
Because you could say, there's a meteor coming towards us. Our planet's going to blow up. Okay, well, then we're going to get this one Djinn to sign a contract and he becomes the meteor Djinn. And that's the only thing he can use his magic on. But you can have it done.
Well, obviously, lawyers would hold a very high place of esteem in this society.
I think that's totally true. In fact, and everyone would have a shade of lawyer to them. Like every Djinn is going to have some part of their mind dedicated to finding the loopholes and looking for the little finagly bits. And so it's not just that somebody who does that regularly is lauded, but like everybody does it. So the lawyers, the actual lawyers in the society are the ones who do it super well. Like they are really good at it. And in fact, on that note, you might just hire Djinn lawyers to do actual law in your like regular society because they're super good at it. Like you're not even like engaging their magical part of it. They're just very, very good.
I feel like the other side of it is these societies are probably on a ticking timer until one of these guys screws up.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So there's probably like legends of societies that were these Djinn binders or whatever.
Yeah.
And their entire society was wiped out when some guy tried to make a butter passing Djinn whose sole purpose was to pass butter and f***ed it up.
Yeah. And destroyed his entire society with an unreality bomb.
Yeah.
I like that. That's good. Oh, in fact, they would probably live in a world where the lasting effects of the unreality bomb, of a bunch of them going off over time, over millennia, are still felt.
Interesting.
Where any number of stupid magical bullshit that you want to include in your world could be explained by, well, there was a guy who like trapped a Djinn here and he f***ed it up and the thing exploded and now there is a upside down mountain where all of the waterfalls go up into the sky and you're like, how did that happen? It's like Djinn bomb, like it just happened. I like that as an explanation for a really big weird world.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah, that's got some potential. I feel like that would influence society where everyone is like historically, the Djinn aren't all that different looking than humans, right?
Yeah.
So everyone would be very careful about their language when talking with anyone.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Just like at any point you might be accidentally agreeing to a contract.
Yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me of, there's all the stories of, like the Fae from Western culture, where there's things like, can you give me your name? And the other person's like, no, if you then just hand it to them, they have got your name and like they own it now. And it's like you can have
verbiage is very important.
Yeah, careful wording. You have to respond with things like, no, but you may call me blank instead. Where it's
exactly.
Like, I like that. Yeah, just to say.
Or where thanking a Fae creature implies that you are in their debt.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, that tells us, I think, something about the world as a whole that we've created here, which is that like contracts have power, like they have actual literal power. Something about maybe the gods, or maybe particular one god, or maybe it had to do with the way that world was created. That everything relies upon deals being held and contracts being honored, and if anybody ever screws that up, it's either not allowed just by nature, where like you cannot break a contract, or the consequences are so dire that people just don't. I like that. So maybe something along the lines of, so imagine a world where you have two gods. It's not even a world yet. This is a nothingness that happens before the world is created. And you have two gods, and they both want to create a world, but they cannot agree about what kind of world they want to create. You have the god of light and the god of dark, and they're like, well, I want to have a world that's full of light. And the other one's like, no, I want to have a world that's full of dark and no light. And they can't agree, but they can't do it without the other one, because if anything one does, the other can immediately undo. And they enter into a contract, the first contract.
Ooh, I like that.
They agree, we will create a world together, and it will maintain these things. And all of the basic parts of the world are laid out in that original contract, the first contract. And it is from that contract that the world is made.
Interesting.
And so this entire, like, not just in reference to the Djinn, but every creature in this world has to abide by contracts, because that is the basis of their fundament. That's the
It's just the underlying principle of the building blocks of the world.
This is the strong nuclear force of their world.
Yeah.
And that explains why when a Djinn is Djinn bombed and they create this like huge unreality area where all of the laws break down and everything goes haywire, it's because they had to break a very important contract. And anytime anybody breaks a little bit of a contract, like the world starts to degrade a little bit.
Interesting.
You know, maybe some creatures can, maybe some creatures can't, or maybe it takes a different amount of effort to consciously break a contract for one reason or another, or to be forced into a situation where you have to break a contract. But every time it happens, it frays the edges of the fabric of reality.
I like the idea that maybe like their version of the apocalypse is like at some point someone is going to make such an unforgivable breach of contract that it undoes the first contract.
Yes, exactly. I love that. Calling it like the null and void or something. Yeah. If enough people, I don't even know, maybe the people of this world do not know what the first contract actually is. Like they know its nature, but they cannot read its text because it's in the language of the gods or something like that. Or it's just that it doesn't exist within the world because it created the world. So everybody's always a little bit worried that if they're doing something outside of the norm, they might be violating one of the clauses and causing the ultimate end. Because, there's a concept in judicial law, I think it's in contract law too, called separability, where if you have a contract and there's two components of it, they can either be separable or inseparable. So if you render one of them void,
they're both void.
Or they're not both void, depending on exactly how the contract is laid out. So you might even have a scenario where you have like one of the clauses of the first contract rendered void, which causes it's huge. It's a terrible thing, but it doesn't cause the entire contract to become null and void. So maybe that's happened once or twice.
So I kind of want to, this kind of spun off a tangent.
Tangents are where we live, man.
So suppose there's like this sect or whatever that's kind of discovered this inseparability part of it and has basically developed a programming language of sorts by breach of contract.
Okay.
Where they've got these long contracts written out that they are intentionally planned to break.
Yeah.
And the way each contract is laid out, parts of it are inseparable, parts of it are not. And contingencies and whatnot will cause various events to unfold.
Oh, that's really cool.
And these guys are probably like viewed as terrorists or whatnot.
No. That everybody else in the rest of the world is like, what you guys are doing is fucking with shit that shouldn't be fucked with. Like you are like intentionally breaking contracts to get the effects that you want. That is anathema to everybody else's like sense of morality. And like you guys are actively endangering the entirety of existence. And they're like, yeah, but like, look at the cool stuff we can do.
Look, I've automated my farming.
Yeah, exactly. Just by like... Oh, that's great. Okay, so and I like the idea that maybe there's two different versions of breaking a contract as well, where one of them is you've been put into a situation where you have to break one contract or another, right? Or there's the version of where it's like, I could follow this contract or I could break it. And that may change what the effects are. So like if you yourself are in a contract that you could continue to go with, but you decide, I don't like the terms of this contract anymore, I am going to break it. All of the unreality problems, all of the fraying of the edges, they reflect inward on you because you made a choice.
Interesting.
Where you're like, okay, no, I'm just going to break this. And so like I think at low levels, it just manifests as like bad luck.
Oh yeah.
Right? Where you break a contract with your friend, you're like, I'm going to sell you this grain. And then you're like, no, never mind. I'm not going to sell you that grain. And they're like, well, you broke our contract. Well, then like the next day, like your grain turns all out, like it's eaten by rats or something. Like that's the most basic version of it. But the bigger the contract that you break and the more intricate and hard it was to break. But if you choose to do it, like eventually it's like, oh yeah, I broke the contract. And the universe is like, oh, you know what? Now you're a frog.
Yeah.
You're like, you are cursed. Like this is where curses come from.
I like it. Yeah.
Is when you choose to break a contract, which is in contrast to if you are forced to break a contract. So like, for example, you tell your friend, I'm going to sell you this grain. It'll be there in 2 weeks. And then you set out and it turns out that like you just can't get there in 2 weeks. Like you are completely unable. You do everything you possibly could and you can't do it. And at that, actually, no, that's not that version. Let me back up. Okay. So you make a contract with one friend. You say, I'm going to sell you some grain and I'm going to deliver it in 2 weeks. And this guy's like, okay. And you make a contract with another guy and you say, I'm going to give you some grain I'm going to sell it to you in 3 weeks. And then it turns out that you're going along your track and you realize, oh no, if I make deadline 1, I can't make deadline 2. And if I make deadline 2, I can't make deadline 1. I have to choose between the 2 contracts. Then violating one or the other, because you are in a situation where you are not the originator of the problems, that's when it reflects outward to the world around you. Like if you break one of those contracts, that's when the edges of reality affect the world around you. Because you're like, oh, okay, I probably shouldn't have signed both of these, but I have to break one or the other. Which one do I break? And whichever one I do, bad things are going to happen, not necessarily just to me, but in the world around me. It's going to cause storms. And
interesting.
And what that means is that people have to work together in order to create a system where, okay, I have to make sure that if I sign a contract with this guy, it doesn't validate clauses in this other guy's contract, such that we create problems for each other. So
this is where clauses like acts of God and whatnot
start
entering into contract.
Yeah, everybody has to pull in a thing. And there's regular clauses where it's not breaking any other contracts, I will do this and this and this. And any other contract written before this one supersedes it and stuff like this. Because you have to be very careful that you don't introduce more and more of contract breaking and reality bending into this world. That's very cool.
So if in this world, are Djinn even separate entities from people? Or is it possible that just everyone in this world is a Djinn or can become a Djinn in the right circumstance?
I like the idea of it being a spectrum.
Okay.
Where you might be what we would think of as a regular human, and you're just on the low end of that magical energy that flows out into the world through you. And then slightly better than that is a free Djinn. And then slightly better than that is a sorcerer, a human sorcerer. And then better than that is a there's a ranking of it. So if a particularly powerful human was restricted, then they get power themselves the same way that a Djinn might.
Interesting.
But it's really just that the culture and the people that we call Djinn in this world are just a society of people who all have high natural magical energy. And what I like about that idea is that means if you are a powerful magic user, you have this magic flowing from you out into the world, then you could put restrictions on yourself in order to gain more power. And maybe that's where the arcane restrictions on things like wizards and sorcerers come from, and why different rule sets for different ones work that way. Is where somebody might go, okay, I'm an untrained wizard. By entering into a contract with, I don't know, myself or something like that, I'm able to say, okay, instead of just having this magic go out from me and flow outwards, instead, when I do this, that will happen instead. And they have put the reason why their magical spells are kind of arcane and they require memorization and filling out books and spell components and things like that is because they have deliberately pinpointed that magical energy. They've created these tiny little things that they can do because they're concentrating a relatively meager amount of magical energy directly and laser focused down onto a single spell, so that they can create sleep or illusions or things like that. That's really cool.
So I think the fallout of that would be a society where specialists are viewed as more important than generalists.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Where you wouldn't just have a handyman or even just a plumber. You'd have here's this plumber who works specifically with copper.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. I love that. And even as a reflection, not just of when they're using magic, but as you're talking about a plumber who works specifically with copper pipes, that is his thing. And it's not that he ever uses magic to do it. It's just his knowledge and everything. He's laser focused down on that one.
He might not even be that good, but there's the prestige of being that guy who does that one thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I love that. Where it's just a reflection on this other part of society where it really, really matters, where everybody else is looking at it and going, well, if it works there, then it must be like this too.
A jack of all trades would almost be an insult.
Yeah, for sure it would be an insult. And in fact, you might find people downplaying their ability to do certain things.
Oh yeah, I like that.
Where he's like, I'm a rice farmer. And people are like, oh, okay, so you could also, I don't know, farm wheat, right? And he's like, I could, but I'm not going to say I could. It's like, no, just rice, only rice. That's the only thing I could ever do. Oh, in fact, no, I'm a farmer. I can't fix my own equipment because that requires a craftsman, and I am not a craftsman. So people either will downplay it or will like go out of their way never to learn new things.
Yeah.
I like that. That's
or
cool.
if they do, they just never tell anyone.
Right. In fact, like
there's a shame to doing something outside of your profession.
I love the idea of a character who has decided to exploit this by having no shame, where they are not only are they a generalist and they can just do a bunch of things that other people can't do, but they will also take credit for the things that they can do themselves, but don't want anyone else to know they can do. So like when the farmer fixes his own gate and he's like, oh crap, I don't want anybody to know. Oh, okay. If anybody asks, I'll say Jim does it. And I give Jim a coin and like, yeah, here you go. I paid you to fix my gate at a really discount rate. And Jim's like, oh yeah, totally. And everybody hates Jim because like, oh, he's
garbage.
That Jim. Yeah, F that Jim guy. He can do whatever he wants. He's not good at anything. And then like, but he's like, whatever. I get paid for it.
Yeah.
I like that character. That would be a fun protagonist in this world. He's like, whatever. I love it. This is a cool idea. What else can we do? We've wandered away from our original idea, but I love the world that we've created. Oh, okay. So then I like the idea of the afterlife being a world where like there's hell is for lawbreakers, hell is for contract breakers.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it depends on how much of, like if you have, like how many times you broke a contract or what was the severity of it, is you have to go and spend time in a world and like this, and you're sent to hell, quote unquote, but it's just a realm of existence where nothing ever works. Like there's no system of laws. Nothing is consistent. It's like pure chaos.
Oh yeah.
As a sort of penance for doing things where you broke laws and you broke the order. You are like flayed by the chaos of unreality of the things of a lawless world.
So morality is more focused on abiding by agreements rather than any sort of like what we might consider morality of like, thou shalt not kill, that sort of thing.
Yeah, everybody is concerned with a sort of collectivist mind frame where it's all about maintaining the society and like maintaining your agreements within that society, as opposed to doing something that you would consider right by some sort of internal barometer. Like, I don't think anybody would even entertain the idea of, oh, well, the law is wrong. And they'd be like, no, that's not how that works. Like, the law defines what's right. And if you did introduce a character into this world who thought, no, what I feel in my heart is more important than the law, they are going to butt their heads up against the world and either get ground down by it and destroyed, or are just going to have to learn to live within a world where nobody agrees with them. Like something about this, this world is set up so that, no, if it is the law, then it is good.
I'm curious, like how things like contracts that would negatively affect other people are viewed. Like, for example, a contract for a hitman or something. Like, you've signed this agreement to assassinate this person. How does the law view that in this particular case?
Well, you could go with the sort of straightforward version, which is like, if it's the law, if it's the contract, then it allows for it. And like, maybe so like in this world, laws are a little bit different than contracts because they are contracts that apply to everyone. They are something that the culture, the population has agreed as a whole to abide by. And so if you make certain kinds of contracts illegal, then you all have agreed, no, we cannot do this. So the culture as a whole could say, no, we don't want contract killing. We don't want contracts for killing. So we create a law that makes them illegal. And that means those contracts are null and void from the start. You cannot create them. And it also means that, breaking them has no consequence, things like that. So you probably can construct a world where that's the case. But if the society decides, no, that's fine. If we get together and by whatever mechanism, even if it is monarchy, everybody sort of agrees the king is in charge, therefore he gets to make the laws, right? So if they decide, no, we want to have contract killing or slavery or whatever awful, thing you can think of, if the society has created laws for it, then the contracts are around it. But on the same token, if somebody, like that's the difference to these people, that's the difference between a robbery and just a gift is like whether or not there's a contract for it. Where I kind of like the idea. If you hand something to someone and say, this is yours now, like that is the verbal contract of, I have transferred this ownership to you. Whereas if somebody comes up to you and like just grabs it and runs off, then they're like, oh no, that's you didn't sign the contract. That's where the theft is. It's because they didn't consent to give it over to you. And that is that not just law breaking in the sense of like, oh, that's wrong, you're going to break our society. It's law breaking in like, you are violating like the law of gravity. Like if you do this too much, like our world is going to end. That's kind of cool.
Yeah. I like the idea that in addition to like these lawmakers being kind of the pinnacle of society, like also people who honor contracts, like have an incredibly good record with honoring important contracts. Like that might be a status symbol of like how they improve in the world.
Yeah, like you could call them the unbroken or something. Or like they're it's a status where like I have never done it consciously, and I have also never been put in a position where I've had to break a contract, and that is a gold star on your reputation. I love that.
The importance of the contracts. Like if you're just sitting there just like making a bunch of little minor fiddly contracts that don't matter, like I was like, okay, well, yeah, that doesn't matter.
Yeah,
but if like you're a defender of the kingdom or whatever, and you've never broken, any contract.
And in fact, you might have people in that society who are kind of kept around for that purpose, where like you've got your cabinet or whatever, and various people who are running your various departments of your kingdom, and one of them is the guy who is the unbroken. He's the one who's he's never ever broken a contract, so that when you have to sign like an important treaty, like it's not the king who does it, it's the unbroken, because his word is better than mine, is like of a higher reputation than mine, because maybe I'm not unbroken.
Okay. Yeah,
I like that. Yeah, that's really cool. It's a really weird world. I like it. Okay, I feel like we have to circle back around on Djinn.
Okay.
So we've talked about the idea that maybe magicians are human magicians are people who have relatively little magical talent, who've like managed to hone that system themselves. So imagine Djinn magicians or wizards who employ the same technique themselves, where by restricting their power down, they are able to like laser focus, but to a much more powerful degree. That's really cool.
So we talked about like obviously like the genie in the lamp kind of. What other methods of restriction do you think would be available to Djinn?
So we talked about elemental and then like sort of role as well. You could have things like one of them could say something like, this would be kind of cool, I will affect change on nothing but copper. They could say like, I will never work copper. I will never break, or I'll never do anything but, actually copper's terrible. Let's do steel. I'll do anything, like I will not work any metal but steel. I will not work wood. I will not work any of these other things. And so he can still use all of those objects, but when he gets to go work on copper, he doesn't need tools, or steel, I'm sorry. When he goes to work on steel, he doesn't need tools. He doesn't need to forge it. He has like a perfect understanding of like its properties when he touches it, because all of his concentration is on that single thing. And like this might be the origin of magical weapons in this world, is like certain Djinn who have decided by restricting just my, like not just my magical abilities to like elements, but like my ability to work on the world down to a single thing. Be like, okay, I'm going to make this one crafted item.
So they basically become kind of like the Hattori Hanzo of weapon craft in this world.
Or even, and then you can imagine like in Legend, like there's a magical, the best weapon in the country, the magical sword. And the legend is that a Djinn promised to make nothing else in his entire life except this one sword.
Oh, I like that.
And he concentrated all of his magical energy into it. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like this. I also like the idea that like Djinn society does not do marriage for life, because that's a contract that has no end and doesn't have like ways out of it. And so like all of them are like, they've like built in these little contracts that are like, okay, 5 years. Like in 5 years, we're going to be married for 5 years. And then after that, we're done.
Yeah, we'll see where things are at then.
Yeah, we might sign a new one then. And so like, in fact, a lot of relationships might be like that, where
their subscription services,
where like when you and your spouse in a Djinn society decide to have a child, you sign a contract that you're like, okay, we are the parents of this child for 18 years or however long it takes a Djinn to grow up, and then we'll figure it out from there. And then who that Djinn's like family is really more about like who they are signing contracts to, who they're building relationships with. And so it's all about like what you do and who you are and like what your chosen identity is, because you have the choice to make these kinds of contracts and to make these minds. To become the prince of the Djinn, it might be more about convincing the Djinn that you should be the prince and like signing a contract with the king to become the prince than being born into it. And so it's not even, meritocracy is not the right word, because it's not necessarily based on merit. It's more like convincing the right people.
Yeah, you're sort of building a system of like almost leveraging yourself into these positions of power.
That's really cool.
I really like the idea of like your family is basically who you have contractually signed to be your family.
Yeah. And it's like it would be like the concept of like a clan or like a troop or something like that, where it's this constructed, actually it has a lot in common with the way Imperial Romans and Republican Romans thought about family, where like the Julii of Julius Caesar, like, yeah, there was blood relation through a lot of that, but a ton of those relationships were adoptions. Like if you were a patrician of ancient Rome and you said, man, I need to have an heir. I'm going to adopt this dude. This guy is really cool. I'm going to make him my son. And like to the point where like I don't even know that they would care how old the guy was. Like I think it was not uncommon to adopt people slightly older than you and be like, no, you are my son now. And as far as the legal system was concerned, like adoptions were as good as any other form of progeny. So like you would choose this guy and say, he is my heir. And that became a way to make deals and to sort of build your clan. It was a lot more about constructing it than who happened to be born into it or not, which is very cool. So you could see Djinn society working kind of the same way, except in more directions, where like it's not just about who you marry or who you adopt, but also being like, yeah, we're cousins now. You know, like that's just how it works. Like, and everybody would be like, oh yeah, no, that is as good. It's better than a blood bond because everybody who is involved with it agreed to it.
Yeah,
I think it's a good argument. Well, I think we've hit 50 something minutes, so I think that's good enough for our Djinn episode. Bye.
See you later.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Monster Mechanics. You can find links and show notes at our website, monsterpod.org. Or if you'd like to support us, head on over to patreon.com/monsterpod. We can be found on Twitter at monstermpod, or you can email us at monstermechanicspodcast@gmail.com. We would love to hear your feedback. Monster Mechanics is produced and edited by Scott Paladin. This episode was hosted by Scott Paladin and Zach Jaquays. All of the ideas produced during this podcast are released under a do what the f*** you want public license.